All right. This is the Denver Erlang and Elixir meetup for Monday, December 4th, 2023. If you're just joining on YouTube, the meetup tonight is sponsored by Praxio.io. That's how you pronounce it. It's apparently pretty difficult. The company does security for Elixir and Phoenix. Also available is Elixir developer security training, as well as penetration testing and consulting. For the main event tonight, I'm actually really excited about this talk. Title's Elixir Makes It Easy. Jason is speaking tonight. He has this great article. I hope I'm not spoiling the talk, but it's about all the things you can use Elixir for. There's a lot of use cases. So
cool. All right. So yeah, hi everyone. I'm Jason Stiebs. I'm based out of Milwaukee. I'm a Phoenix framework specialist at Fly.io. I've been on the Phoenix core team since pretty much the beginning, and kind of an Elixir super fan since the very beginning. And in honor of like everyone else answering the question, I don't think we're hiring right now, and I'm not looking for work at the current moment. Sorry, did someone say something, or did I?
No, you're good. You're good.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry.
Oh, you're good. All right. Cool. Yeah. So my background, like in school, Java, C, and C#. I did a tour duty, an internship of all the .NET stuff. Learned Ruby on Rails and Node.js early adopter. Like some of my earliest Node.js projects no longer run because the Node version isn't available on the website anymore. And kind of Elixir ever since. And tons of JavaScript and CSS and HTML like the whole time. Kind of reflected on my work. I ran a startup consulting contracting firm for startups and stuff for 12-ish years. Currently at Fly, did a bunch of Phoenix core stuff and a bunch of random open source stuff. If you're looking to get involved with open source, like my best piece of advice is just use people's stuff and find bugs and report them. That's how I got involved in Phoenix, and that's how I'm on the Phoenix core team. Did a lot of ecto bug finding in the early days. But suffice to say, like pretty much the whole time, I've been doing web dev pretty much my whole career. And what I used, I was kind of reflecting back and preparing for this talk, like all the different web dev technologies. I've mostly been on the back end. And right when I graduated school, I wanted to use Ruby, but I didn't really want to use Rails. So I kind of used a weird Ruby stack, where we use SQL, which is kind of like the active record, but alternative record in Rails with Postgres, and I used Rhoda, which is a kind of a routing framework for Ruby, and Sidekick, which is a worker queue for Ruby, and Faraday, a REST client, and Heroku. And then at the time, I think the JavaScript framework was Backout, Knockout, and Angular. And at the time, the problems I was solving in 2012 were, I was making concurrent HTTP requests, handling concurrent API requests, because I often did APIs for front ends or mobile apps, making concurrent database requests, and trying to do it all in parallel. Similar problems I think a lot of us maybe have today, right? Like the problems we're actually solving if we look down at what a backend developer is mostly doing. At the time, I was trying to do it in Ruby, maybe a mistake. And as anyone who deployed Ruby back in that time, it was kind of a trash heap. Like we're all trying to solve Moore's law problem, do a lot of this stuff concurrently with parallel programming and stuff. And it wasn't great, right? Like this was kind of the time that Elixir started, right? Like Node.js was starting to come up, and they had all these solutions with libuv and V8 to try to handle concurrent programming, assuming you wanted to use promises or callbacks. Tons of things were happening in Ruby, and still are, like JRuby and mRuby, and now there's the JIT and all this different stuff. And there's tons of stuff happening with the JVM with Scala enclosure and stuff. And if you're familiar, if you remember back in that time, like anytime there's a thread and how are we going to handle this concurrency problem and use all of our corals and do parallels, and there's always someone who would jump in and say, let's use Scala, it's great, scale, it's right in the name, right? And now Scala's nowhere. But I was curious, right? I was looking around, what can I try? I tried Erlang and kind of bounced off the dev UX. I'd kind of gotten used to Ruby's dev UX, and I didn't really want to not have a package manager and stuff, and I was extremely lucky to find this tool Elixir. It was I think this picture kind of represents how I felt about it, right? Here's Elixir allowing me to use this lightsaber, this tool from a more civilized time, and use it effectively. Use Erlang and the Beam virtual machine effectively in ways that previously I'd bounced off of. And I was familiar with Jose, right? He's in the Ruby community. I knew he was the real deal. He'd done a lot of conference talks. He's on the Rails core team. and he was in IRC. He'd help you with if you had any problems with, something went wrong with Ecto or something went wrong with Mix or Hex or Elixir, or, anything, at the time it was Dynamo, before Phoenix, like he'd just be helping in IRC and stuff. So pretty early, I think Ecto V1, I decided to put it into production. So like what I started using around 2015, I don't know the exact dates. I'm just kind of just guessing, but my stack was Ecto for the database with Postgres, Phoenix. I used EXQ because I was porting a lot of Ruby API to Elixir, and I used sort of the Sidekick compatibility, the Redis job queue as sort of like my interface. So like the Ruby library would put jobs into Elixir, and then would put jobs into Sidekick and Redis, and then the EXQ library pull them off, and I would do a bunch of either asynchronous work or tasks, and then I started just moving API calls one at a time over to Elixir, and deployed it to Heroku, obviously still. And it, the JavaScript framework changed. At this point is reacting on Ionic, and who knows what CSS framework we were all using. But it all changed a bunch for the front end work. And like if I compare that to what I'm using now in 2023, it really hasn't changed that much. I'm still using Ecto, I'm still using Phoenix. If I'm deploying a job queue, I'm using Opengl probably. I'm not using Hackney, I'm using Rec. I'm probably not deploying to Heroku. I'm probably deploying to Fly, Render, any of those other services, right? And, if I have my choice, I'm using LiveView instead of making an API. And just kind of reflecting back on like why I moved to LiveView, like what I've done most of my whole career, and like how I would describe Elixir in general is I would describe Elixir as an extremely practical language. I think, from the very beginning, from Jose's choice of choosing the Beam, from what libraries and frameworks he decided to work on, what language features he chose, how he chose to use them. Like everything about Elixir is extremely practical. And, like that, Jose's an extremely practical guy, right? Like, just like in Ruby, everyone's, Mats is nice in Ruby, so everyone in Ruby is nice. Jose's practical in Elixir, so we're all practical. And, like it also just stems from the fact that Elixir is an extremely high leverage language. Like, I'll never forget when we first put that first Elixir service up on Heroku, and like I was able to take down a Ruby service that, all my Ruby workers that were like these big PX dynos, and they had all this memory and RAM, 4 or 5 of them. And I was able to replace all of them with a single free tier dyno, right? Like that was incredible, right? Like he's running on less than 500 megabytes of RAM, doing all these jobs, making all these API requests, doing this database stuff. And it was barely even sweating this Heroku dyno. And I remember, this is a little bit, sidebar, but we used to be the IRC guys, Heroku guys. Heroku itself uses a lot of, or maybe previously used a lot of Erlang. They used actually Cowboy for the router, and I think still to this day they use Cowboy. They might have just replaced it like in the last few months, but those people would all hang on IRC and chat with us and talk with us, and we'd always joke that Elixir would destroy their business model, because like a lot of their business model was based on Ruby projects, like taking up a lot of memory and like really forcing people to spend money on Heroku. But like, like that was just like an example for me, whereas like as a contractor, I'm saving all this money for my client, I'm saving all this money for myself. Like I was able to really like use a tool that like the code was not that different than what I had written in Ruby, but like using, Postgres, using all the same stuff, like I was able to get all this out, way more out of my hardware, right? And like, I wasn't that worried about putting Elixir and Ecto into production, right? Because like the Beam has decades of engineering behind us, right? And like I said before, Jose and like Eric and all the people on IRC, Chris, with Phoenix and stuff, are extremely patient and supportive on IRC or the mailing list, or now Slack or Discord or any of the places you could find them there. And like the documentation, even back then, was top notch, right? And it's an extremely productive environment, right? Like that, which also helps its practicality, right? Like our standard library has docs and examples, right? Like none of these things are a given, even in a modern day language, right? Like some languages, still to this day, like their docs are literally just whatever is on top of the module, on top of each function. And like, maybe if you're lucky, there's an example, right? Like a lot of the Beam is like that. There's not a ton of examples in the Beam docs, right? Like in Elixir docs, it's like standard that every module doc is basically a book. Like EXDocs documentation is essentially a book for how to use EXDoc. And like Elixir has the entire Beam runtime. Like we didn't have to make a new HTTP library. We had Cowboy. Obviously now we have Bandit, but at a time, and still we could use Cowboy. We could build off the shoulders of, 40 years of Beam work and development and improvement and incremental improvement. And again, I just want to highlight that Mix and Hex and EXDocs are absolutely incredible. Like it's still not a given to this day. Like, you think a modern language like Rust has these things, equivalent cargo for mix, hex for, I think cargo or crates is what they call it for hex equivalent, and they have their own documentation. But like Elixir and Rust are kind of like the only modern language that came with those things out of the box. Like you think of, like you hear other languages that are kind of cool and hip right now, like Zig, like they have a documentation standard, but like only just now. They don't have a package standard. They don't have a package management standard. They don't have an answer for it. And like part of me is just like wants to grab them by the shoulders and be like, Hex figured this out 10 years ago and it's great and it works. And it's like, we don't have the same problems that NPM does. We don't have the same problems that all these other teams have and projects have. And like, like Go did a lot of great things. Like, sorry, this is a little bit of tangent. Go did a lot of great stuff with their, Go format and their really fast compiler and, their standard library and their documentation is all really good. But like, they didn't figure out the package management stuff. And this solution they landed on even today sucks. So like, we have it really good here, right? Like, in this, if you think about like high productivity teams, like big Elixir projects, like in 2019, Elixir, the CTO of Discord was posting to Hacker News that he had 4 people, servicing 5 million requests, 5 million concurrent users in Discord. In the last 4 years, I'm sure it hasn't grown a ton more. Like it's maybe a 10 or I don't know exactly what goes on in Discord. They're pretty quiet, but they don't have tons of job postings. They're not like at every conference begging developers to show up, like Spotify or Shopify does for Ruby or GitHub does for Ruby, right? So like, there's a classic WhatsApp story where like 40 engineers serviced billions of people all around the world with 40 servers, right? And using Erlang, right? Like it's extremely productive, extremely practical, extremely high leverage. And I always have to throw this in, we're a Lisp, right? So like all the stuff that people write about Lisp and talk about Lisp, where, you have macros and your code is data, you have your read eval, print loop, you have our protocols, which are inspired by closures protocols. We have recursions for programming. We have immutability. Like we have all the stuff that people like when they're talking about Lisp, they're just going on and on about how great and amazing it is. We have that in Elixir because it's a Lisp. And like, if you don't believe me, go check out this hex docs. Go check out the docs for Elixir, the guides. They're now hosted on hex docs. They previously weren't, but there's optional syntax guide. And at the very end, he shows an example here of math where he shows a module, like how you'd normally write it, but down below is sort of like what it also valid Elixir syntax, right? Like if this would parse and this would execute, right? And if you squint and you convert the tuples and the square brackets to parentheses, that's a Lisp, right? Like, it's not exactly a Lisp, but it's pretty close, right? Like if you made a couple changes, you could definitely see this as a Lisp. And I think, we can do so much more than just the web stuff, right? Like if there's one thing you come away with today is like, we can do like so much more in Elixir than just web programming. And I think like some really great examples out there is like, obviously live view is in the context of web programming. Like if you try to imagine what you'd have to do with live view, like if you look at the live view competitors and what they'd have to do to like compete or to replace live view or even to do what live view does, it's like so much back, they have to bend over backwards. They have to use Redis. They have to use third-party tools, third-party databases, third-party distribution manager just to do what live view does, right? Like that's like a really creative way of rethinking like how we can use the incredible, the incredibleness of Elixir and the Elixir in our ecosystem and the Erlang virtual machine. They do really incredible stuff. Another example, obviously, is NX and Bumblebee. Like we all kind of just, shrug and be like, oh, we have it, it's cool. We can do this cool stuff. But like, you really got to like zoom out a little bit and look at like what other languages can do this, right? Like Go can't do this without shelling out to C or Python. Rust kind of can do this. They have some libraries, thanks to Hugging Face. Maybe they're the only other example other than Python. But like that, yeah, we're doing like actual machine learning, not just like running the big models, but like low level. If you want to build a full neural network yourself, you can do it. If you want to run classic linear algebra or linear regression kind of functions, you can just do that in NX and Bumblebee, and that's incredible, right? And like it's only expanding. NX, if you haven't looked at Scholar or Explorer, like the number of things they allow you to do is really, really neat, right? Like, and that's so far away from web development, right? And I think that's cool. That's really great, right? Because the world's way more than web. Distribution's another really good example. There's a couple things that are coming from this that are building off a distribution that are coming in the pipeline that I can't talk about yet, but are pretty cool and pretty exciting. But I really think, partially because of, how hard it is to deploy an app and use distribution on Heroku and similar tools, Like maybe distribution got shortchanged. Like, oh, maybe don't use distribution unless you really know what you're doing. Or the advice was always like, really got to know what you're doing. Maybe don't use this. But I think, now that there's companies like Fly and like Render and, even AWS, like in making it easier to do VPNs, making it easier to find your other servers and connect to them. Kubernetes also makes this a lot easier. I think we're just scratching the surface as a community about what we can do with distribution, but it's also like this superpower we have. And it's just like here and hanging out, like in the Erlang OTP library, you can just do, Erl colon Erl RPC call, and you can call any machine and like in any function and do anything like in your distribution. And like, it's really incredible and it's easy to forget about, right? And, obviously there's nerves, which is just the super neat. Who would have guessed that nerves would be a thing that exists? But here we have it, and we can make anything with our little hardware, little Raspberry Pis, and do all kinds of really cool stuff that, like, I play with it all the time, and I'm always like, man, this is incredible. I don't have to write Python or MicroPython, sorry, or Micronode or whatever, C or C++. I can just do this in Elixir and Erlang, and it's exactly the same tools that I would use if I was programming on my computer. So yeah, I mean, if there's one thing you come away with today is like, I hope like we can think just a little bit further, like what can we do without the web? What else can we do with Erlang? And like, I got a couple examples. One of my favorite examples is this project called Wings 3D. If you're not familiar with it, it's kind of like this 3D module. It's not a full like Blender replacement, but you can kind of take models like you kind of see on the left here and subdivide it and make smooth models. But I remember back when I was learning Blender, like in high school, like just for fun, I had a little class about digital art, and like Blender was a small thing we talked about Maya and Blender and those things. And I remember reading on a forum, someone was like, should I use Wings or should I use Blender? And like, obviously now is, Blender's one for open source modelers. And I thought this project had died, but it was released the latest release is October 2023. And this is like all Erlang, like the whole world's like, oh, Erlang is great for distributed systems and networking and TCP and, 9 nines of uptime and, 10, 20, 15. I don't even know when it's created. Maybe I should have looked it up for this talk, but like 10, 15 years ago, someone was like, you know what? 3D programming, 3D modeling, desktop app, right? Like, and like it's right here in the Erlang docs, right? You look at the Erlang org, there's an OpenGL module with the entire OpenGL spec just available for you. The documentation isn't great. Like, you have to read the OpenGL reference, classic OTP stuff, but like, it's just there. If you want to make an OpenGL project, like it's just there in Elixir, or it's in your Erlang right now. You can use it, assuming you built with WX bindings. It's just there, and you can use it, and you can make apps. It's pretty cool. And I figure I should probably, have my own example of making weird and cool stuff. So I haven't released the code for this publicly yet, but I've been tinkering it on the side. It's called Live Canvas, and it's kind of like a project where you can do art. And I'll do a little demo. What's a meetup talk without a little demo? So yeah, just assume if someone could give me a thumbs up or a chat or something if they can see this. Yeah, 2001. Thank you, Erica. Hopefully you can see. Yep, Erica. Cool. I'll make the text a little bigger just in case. But yeah, all right. So basically on the left here, you have a little Monaco editor, which does build with ESBuild now. So there will be a blog post at some point about how I got Monaco working with ESBuild, because it's way easier to use now than it used to be. And then on the right side is the output. So there's this special variable canvas, and if you set to it, it'll render a canvas. So over here, we have a canvas with in height of 1400 by 1400. I clear the rectangle, set the stroke width, set the font, and here's the rectangle I drew, 100 by 100 at pixel point 100 by 100 canvas. So this is an HTML canvas. I know I said think outside the web, but you'll see why I did this in HTML in a little bit. And this is all live view as well. So this is all Elixir, and then I drew a candle over here. And like you have the full, you can use all of Elixir here. So here I'm reducing over the canvas and, just creating a hello world, plus the difference here for 10, and if maybe you don't want to do hello world, maybe you want to do like some abstract art, like, any kind of drawing you can do with Canvas, you can do here. And like how I made that work is I have this Canvas module that implements the entire canvas rendering 2D context. And it's a live view hook where you push a list of ops. So in this case, the op would be the function name and the arguments. And I generated all this code using the web IDO, so graciously provided by W3C. I just downloaded it in a live book, and then I also downloaded the docs and code from MDN because all their docs are in JSON, and then just built a string with the module and all the functions at the end with their docs. So I'll be releasing this open source hopefully soon, and it's got documentation. I tried to do type specs, but it didn't really match super well with type specs. And if anyone wants to ask me questions about this afterwards, I'm happy to answer questions about this stuff because I am kind of moving fast. I understand it. But and then that's not all with Canvas. There's also, so let me just hide this so that we can see it. There is also I forgot. I got to do this whole thing. Yeah. There's also, if you're familiar with SDF functions, basically someone a long time ago, or someone in the shader community, in the graphics community, figured out that if you use shaders a certain way and you know the distance from a point, from every other point in the scene, you can draw shapes. So I have that. So we'll go here. Like I hit it, but essentially you can try to draw using a WebGL context. I can draw a circle, So I basically, in this case, I drew a circle, and I can set this to A, comment it out. So here's my flat circle. I made it. If I put onion in front of it, it expands it into an onion. So this is kind of a strange thing. I'm not sure I'm going to open source the SDF bit because it's kind of a weird thing you have to think about. But so that's my circle that I made an onion. So that kind of just expands it into kind of a flat onion circle. And then if errors are kind of annoying, but up here I take the difference between that my onion circle with that in a box and shift. And you can kind of see it. Here's the difference. It took the box right out of the center. I could shift that around or make that bigger, smaller. Oh, in this case, this first argument is like how round it is. Not a great documentation here. And if I change C here, it takes the intersection of these two, so it only takes the parts that connects. Kind of neat. And then I have this final example, rings here. So this is kind of useful as, maybe you want to push this into a dot plotter. More rings, less rings. It kind of makes just art. But the idea here is make abstract art and you draw on a canvas, you draw on an SDF. And you can kind of just do stuff. And I'm not doing this to ship it and make it a super productionized thing, right? It's kind of a hack, every level, I was kind of, glossing over some of the hacks and stuff. And, kind of like I was saying, I've got this live book that just really does a bunch of hacks over top of JSON to make a module that we can use. And kind of the idea though is make stuff, right? Try to make cool stuff, weird stuff, performance stuff people thought was impossible, like NX or live view or nerves, right? Stuff that you would have never even guessed, right? I think we're very practical, but ideally we'd be a little less practical. I'm hoping that people maybe come away with this kind of interested and excited in the live canvas a little bit, or other projects, but or wings, right? But I think in Elixir we're too practical, and ideally we're a little less practical. And yeah, it's hopefully I kind of talked super fast, so I kind of went under my time. So I'll take any questions, but if you want to find me, I'm on Twitter at Peregrine, X at Peregrine, and Blue Sky at Peregrine. There's my Mastodon, my GitHub. You can always email me at Fly. I post a lot of blog posts on Phoenix Files. I had that recent post where I talked about all the really cool stuff you can do in Elixir, where I try to be as exhaustive as possible to list all the cool, weird stuff. So if you need more inspiration, there's that blog post. And yeah, I apologize for going away under time.